Hello everyone and welcome to today's learning session, Deforestation Success Stories and the Role of REDD, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns and I am the manager for REDD Learning and Communications. Our presenter today is Pipa Elias, a forest policy consultant working with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips and reminders. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you can access the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To find the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forestclimate and look for the REDD Learning section on the left-hand side of the page there. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers or you can dial in through the number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer, this can sometimes be caused by having too many software applications open or too many internet windows open. So feel free to close some of them and that usually solves the problem, or you're always welcome to join via the phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send me or my colleague Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area if possible, and we will try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please submit your questions for Pipa through the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link to the place on reddcommunity.org where you can access a PDF of this presentation and a link to the recording of the session. So again, you will receive a link to that website in the follow-up email. So thanks again for joining us, and with that we'll get started and I will turn it over to Pipa.
Great. Thank you, Breen. So here's just a quick outline. I'm going to start the presentation by going through how we define success and then give a number of examples. And this kind of first half of the presentation will basically just focus on the facts and the numbers, and then I'll go into our analysis of the policies and approaches that we can apply to understand what happened in these success stories that we'll be talking about today and why. And that will include REDD. And then, as Breen said, I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So the data from this whole presentation is going to be from a new report from the Union of Concerned Scientists Tropical Forest and Climate Initiative. So just as a brief introduction, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and of course, like almost everyone else, we go by our acronym UCS, is a science-based advocacy organization, which means that we try to impact policy based on the best available science. So we do a lot of engagement with the public and with experts on the science behind the issues that we work on. And we have a small team that works on tropical forests, and the rest of our staff work on a large range of other issues from nuclear weapon safety to clean vehicles. The tropical forest team just released this report last month at the UN climate negotiations, and you can go to the website I have listed here to download the report in the full report in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And I want to take this opportunity to thank my co-authors, Doug Boucher, Jordan Fairs, and Sharon Smith. And I'll put this website up again at the end of the presentation in case you don't have time to get to it now. And it's also pretty easy to find if you Google deforestation success. So to get the information for this report, we solicited a lot of input for finding global successes in either reducing emissions or increasing sequestration in the land sector in developing countries. And then on top of kind of all the stories we heard from people, we set a few rigorous standards for defining success and deciding which stories to include. And I want to go through two of our kind of most important qualifications. So first, we needed to see quantitative data to indicate that either emissions reductions or sequestration had actually been accomplished. So this could have been either through calculations directly of the emissions or through a very well correlated and well related proxy like forest area. So this means we didn't look at results like plans developed or any other kind of early indicators that could eventually lead to success, but hopefully those are stories we'll see in the future. Our second kind of major qualification was that we required that the results be verified by an independent group in some way. So for a lot of this, we found that kind of independent analysis in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, but we used other sources as well that are listed here. Some other kind of important notes about what we were looking for is that we would not have accepted any results in which social or environmental safeguards were violated, but that ended up actually not being an issue for any of the cases that were presented to us. Also, this wasn't an exercise in capturing any possible or all possible failures, but really just looking at a number of successes that have been verified. And we certainly did hear about other successes that we couldn't find the independent data to justify. And then this last point on the slide is that what defines success is different in different circumstances. So it really depends on where the country is in the forest transition curve to determine whether or not there was a success. And so I'll use the next slide to explain that. The forest transition curve is a conceptual model, and it's based on kind of data that have been seen over and over again throughout history. So essentially it predicts that forest cover in a country, which is here on the Y, the up and down axis, will decrease with time, which is here on the X horizontal axis. And usually this is associated with economic development. So forest cover will decrease, ultimately reaching a low point, and then eventually rebound a little bit and stabilize. So depending on where the country sits on this forest transition curve, we would expect to see different results in terms of success. So this slide shows all the countries, or most of the countries that were included in the report, and where they sit on the forest transition curve. So Guyana and Central Africa have relatively low rates of deforestation, while most countries have a lot of deforestation going on, and then a few are on the rebound. So for countries on the kind of far left-hand part of the curve, we would define success as keeping deforestation rates low. For the majority of countries, they're on the steep part of the curve, so they're losing a lot of forests, and we would define success as reducing deforestation from the current level. And for those countries that are on the rebound part of the curve, we would define success as increasing net forest cover, so that would mostly be through reforestation efforts. So if you can keep kind of a picture of this curve in your mind through the rest of the presentation, it would really be helpful, because I'll refer back to where the different countries are as I go through the examples. So hopefully that made sense in terms of setting up what success means in different contexts, and you have an understanding of our approach to defining success. So now I'll go through a number of examples that we have in the report. And I'm going to start with Central Africa, which is an area that doesn't have a high rate of deforestation. So it's on that top left-hand part of the forest transition curve, and we would define success as keeping these low deforestation rates low. There's a huge block of tropical forests, as you can see here in this map, it's very important to make sure that the threat of increasing deforestation stays out of this area. And what we found was that scientific studies show that over the past decade, the low deforestation rates in the Central African region have gone even lower. So there have been some regional efforts by the governments to improve logging practices and improve management of the sector. So that has contributed. But also, what's really interesting is that the science indicates that a lot of the success in the region hasn't been due sometimes to specific policy approaches, but it's more closely related to increasing wealth, and that increasing wealth is often from mineral and oil booms. And that wealth is increasing urban populations and reducing the pressure on forests. And in these same studies, they found that a lot of the food production is leaving the region, and they're importing more of their food. So I'll talk about the implications of this kind of unique result in terms of policy later in the presentation. So the next and probably most well-known example is Brazil. If you can remember from the forest transition curve, it's a country on the steep part of the curve, and so we would define success as reducing deforestation. And indeed, we've seen a huge decrease in deforestation in the Amazon, about 70%, compared to a baseline of an average from 1996 to 2005. And the success in Brazil is due to a large number of really kind of complex and intermingling factors that were all happening at the same time. So, you know, I definitely suggest reading this chapter in the report, but, you know, these ranged from political will to implement REDD at the highest levels of government, really. Investment in the Amazon Fund from Norway, in law enforcement, voluntary moratoria by the private sector to stop using deforested lands for agriculture, pressure from civil society, etc. So it really has taken actions and interventions at almost every level by a lot of different types of actors to make such a huge result happen. And really it makes sense when you see that this is the biggest emissions reduction basically by any country in the world in the same time period. So these results have been verified through the data analysis of many researchers. Brazil has one of the most transparent and sophisticated satellite kind of remote sensing monitoring systems of deforestation, and all of their data are freely available to the public for these kinds of analysis. But when you put this into perspective of the entire Brazilian economy, we can see two major trends. So in this graph, emissions from land use change, which is almost all deforestation, is in green at kind of the top of each bar. And you know, these data show that they have been the major source of emissions for the country, and they've been reducing, especially since that 1996 to 2005 middle period. But also in the bottom half of each bar, you can see that fossil fuel emissions and agriculture emissions have been increasing steadily over the same time period. So that could possibly have implications for the government if they want overall emissions reductions. So the next example I'm going to go over is Mexico, close to the bottom of the forest transition curve. So we could expect to see a quick reduction in deforestation as a success, and maybe in the future see some reforestation efforts begin as it kind of bounces up. Mexico really has been an international leader on addressing climate change, and their work on addressing emissions from deforestation have been embedded into a larger government-wide goal of reducing emissions for the whole country. And they designed a program within this government-wide goal to pay for ecosystem services to get the outcomes that they wanted. And they were going to start with water and carbon as the first ecosystem services that they were going to pay for. And generally, payment for ecosystem services programs are designed to have the users of the service, so in this case, the users of water or carbon, pay the providers of the service. And what we saw in the end in Mexico is that a lot of the money went to the poorest communities from the ecosystem services program. So it didn't particularly go to those communities that were producing the most water or carbon ecosystem services. And a lot of it ended up being paid for by the government rather than being paid for directly by the people who were using the ecosystem services. So in a sense, the program didn't work as they planned and as the economists would have wanted and predicted. But what's really interesting is that the data that Mexico has reported, and it's been verified by the OECD, is that the outcome has still been hugely positive. And deforestation rates, especially of primary forests, which is what's shown in this figure, have really plummeted. And the kind of researchers have found that that's because these poor rural households that were receiving the payments ended up voluntarily deciding to use them for improved forest management. So still got the outcome even though it wasn't exactly as planned. El Salvador is a really interesting example. It's a country that's at the very bottom of the forest transition curve, and so their success would be in increasing forest cover. They really bottomed out in terms of forest cover during their civil war, and researchers estimate that during that time only 6% of El Salvador's natural forests remain undisturbed. And they think that this was mostly due to high pressure from a really dense population. And peace has accomplished a couple of outcomes in terms of forests, obviously a lot of other outcomes as well. But there were two main things that researchers have found. One was that after the war was over, land titling was reformed, and so that reduced the inequality of rural land control, and it increased the number of rural households with titles, so they had more kind of power over their land. And second, remittances, which is money sent back to people in the country from abroad. So remittances from citizens who left during the war are extremely common in El Salvador. In 2010, about 45% of households received remittances, and researchers have found a correlation between the areas of kind of forested areas that receive the highest remittances and an increase in forest cover. A lot of this increase in forest cover is in shade-grown coffee, so it's different from the natural forest, but biology researchers have found that it still improves the biodiversity within the country. Vietnam is a country that has passed the low point of the forest transition curve. So we would define success in terms of increasing forest cover. And they put into place a government program to increase reforestation, as you can see from this figure, mostly through plantations, and it has worked to increase forest cover. What's particularly interesting is that this has occurred at the same time that Vietnam has increased their role in food exports, especially in rice. So this is kind of an example that the idea of agricultural productivity and forest cover don't necessarily need to compete. What is still going on in Vietnam is that illegal logging still threatens a lot of the small amount of natural forest that's remaining. So that's something that probably still needs to be addressed. But in terms of forest cover, we've seen a success in Vietnam. Kenya is a country kind of on the cusp between the kind of left-hand side of the forest transition curve and the steep downward slope. So any efforts to reduce deforestation rates or avoid kind of future deforestation are important successes. So this is project level success in the Kasigao project, and it was originally established in the 1990s to provide an elephant, a corridor for elephants to connect two national parks. But now it also protects the carbon stock of about 200,000 hectares of dry woodland forest. And listed here are kind of the multiple facets of the project that have made it work. So this includes helping local communities improve their agriculture and charcoal making practices, paying some cattle ranchers who own a lot of the land to put the land into conservation rather than grazing. And this middle point, it was really interesting to see kind of the variety of local economic development that has gone on with the funds from this project. So they tried to make a lot of new jobs outside of agriculture, and one of the things they did was that this work attracted the company Puma to build an organic cotton t-shirt factory in the area. Other kind of economic development they've done are building 20 schools, employing local people to do a lot of the monitoring and biological research on the project. So it's been pretty complex for something that you think, oh, it's just a project, but there's just a lot going on. And what's been reported is that the voluntary carbon credit sales have reached 1.2 million US dollars, and that's been gone into paying for a lot of these activities. So we have a number of other chapters in the report, so it would be great if you could take a look at the whole thing to get the entire picture of success in reducing deforestation and increasing reforestation. In Guyana, we saw that the national government has partnered with Norway to keep low deforestation rates low. For Madagascar, we give kind of a case study of a community management project that is connecting two very biodiverse ecosystems and reducing deforestation, and that also just has a lot of different activities associated with it. In India, they've undergone a massive scale reforestation effort while providing communities with forest management rights to make that happen. Costa Rica has a pledge to become a carbon neutral country, and forests are a big part of that for them. And efforts across Tanzania and Mozambique in the Miombo woodlands to reduce poverty and increase what they call participatory forest management in communities has contributed to reduce deforestation. So in the month since we released the report, we've seen a lot of very positive reactions from those who are interested in REDD and reducing deforestation, to know that it's possible for these successes to happen. And one thing that is important to note, and I hope came through in all those slides, is that one thing, there's a lot of different actors that have been involved in making these successes possible. So from Salvadorans who fled their country during the war to interventions by entire governments like in Brazil. And we really think that all of those people deserve credit for the positive results. So kind of going into the policies now. what has all this research shown us about the policies and approaches that work to produce success? So we ended up breaking these stories into 3 categories. The first is those that pretty much worked as planned to get the outcomes in terms of reducing deforestation or increasing forest cover. Brazil is kind of the biggest example of this. The second category is policies that didn't work exactly as planned, but still got a good result. So I spoke about how that happened in Mexico. And finally, there were some cases where there wasn't a lot of specific policies in place to make the success happen, but it was more related to a change in the socioeconomic context that created the positive outcome. And Central Africa is a good example of that. So we broke up the chapters of the report into those 3 categories. So when you take a look at it, you'll see that the first set of chapters fit into the first category, and then the next set into the second, and the final stories are from the last category. So I want to go through a number of the common elements amongst these successes and the approaches that worked. We found that not all the situations had all of these, and others had a lot of overlaps of a lot of these approaches going on at the same time, but this is just kind of what our analysis showed us. So REDD+, as probably most of the attendees know, stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation and Other kind of pro-forest activities. And it's mostly well known as a policy tool from the UN climate negotiations, and it's a way to address climate change and deforestation at the same time. So we found that a lot of the countries in our report were implementing REDD+ in a variety of forms, and no 2 countries really approached it the same way, but the political momentum behind the idea and the goal of REDD+, and the approach of using forests to address climate change was really important in a number of the cases. Decentralization of forest resources. Some of the examples we saw included changing land titling, providing local communities with more forest management authority, etc. We saw that that was really important. We have a couple of examples where there were payment for ecosystem services programs, mostly in Mexico and Vietnam, and those, as I said, worked, even though they might not have worked as planned. Governance changes, it's closely related to decentralization, but includes some other changes as well, and some of them, a lot of those are very specific within each case, but some actions that were taken on the ground for positive changes there. I think as I mentioned in the Brazil example, we saw that in some cases improvements in law enforcement as a specific kind of improvement in governance was pretty common and helpful. So in a lot of these examples, the right laws were on the books to protect forests, but they needed an extra effort from policymakers to really make it happen, either in terms of paying for enforcement or actually implementing the laws all the way to going to court cases. Moratoria is another example of an action that can provide positive results. So as I mentioned, in Brazil there have been, for example, a voluntary moratoria by soy farmers to make sure they don't grow their crops in any area that has been recently cleared of forests. And what's really interesting to see is that these farmers were able to implement that at the same time that Brazil was able to increase their exports of soy. And last, kind of this multiple outcomes. What was extremely common across these cases is that combining environmental programs, so those that kind of got positive forest outcomes, with those that also provide social and economic development is really important. And we saw the kind of clear link between those positive social and economic outcomes and getting a positive environmental result. And so this is something that I think a lot of the readers of the report think is a really positive benefit. So, unfortunately we didn't find kind of a specific prescription or kind of recipe that we could write of, doing X, Y, and Z makes a success happen, but we definitely have some ideas of what could work for expanding these successes. So first, in the countries that were in that third policy category I mentioned, the places where changes occurred even though it might not have been the result of a specific policy but more a change in the socioeconomic context, it's important to solidify those successes through policies and direct decisions and getting them enshrined. Second, as I think the previous slide shows very clearly, there's a huge range of approaches that can work, and so any financing or international mechanism to promote these kinds of results should really be flexible and allow for variation from country to country. The successes that we saw that in which the efforts were more bottom up, and some others were kind of top down, and it was just such a variety. I mean, some were done at the community level, others were done at kind of the national level. What happened in kind of Central Africa was at the regional level. And we also saw that some of the variation was also in whether or not the programs focused on carbon and kind of the climate relationship with forests. Some others focused on addressing the drivers of deforestation, and others really were more on kind of focused on communities and rights and livelihoods, and all of these worked. Last point on this slide is that analysis and evaluation of these results is pretty important for both ensuring the success can be independently verified and also to understand what the implications of policy decisions are and how they have an impact. So just a few more conclusions. We, I think, have all seen over the past few years that it's pretty clear that the largest global drivers of deforestation are pressure from international markets for commodities like soy and beef and palm oil and timber. But many of these successes that we found show that commodity production can continue while also addressing deforestation. So that was a really interesting result to us. And I guess the most important conclusion of all is that all the stories in this report show that action can be taken to protect the world's forests and address climate change. And so that kind of work to achieve those goals should continue in other parts of the world, and that often requires funding. So that needs to come through, and then we can kind of see these successes hopefully at an even larger scale. So with that, just want to thank you for listening to me for such a long time, and this is just a reminder of where the website is posted in multiple languages, and I'm happy to answer any questions, so I'll turn it back over to Breen to moderate the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Pipa. That was a great presentation. And so as a reminder, as Pipa mentioned, we have some time now for questions. So please use your toolbar to submit questions. And I just want to point out there are two options. One is to raise your hand. Please don't do that. Please type in your actual question into the question box, and we will answer as many as we have time for today. So to kick us off, Pipa, the first question is, with the exception of Brazil and Guyana, a lot of the examples from this report aren't in those countries that are known for receiving REDD money. How have these other countries where you found successes been funded?
Great, thanks, Breen. So, I kind of ended the presentation by talking about, the need for continued funding and for funding to expand these successes. And one of the reasons that we reached that conclusion is that, of course, the agreements between Norway with Brazil and Norway with Guyana are very well known efforts for REDD, and there are, other much smaller scale bilateral efforts between some funding countries and other places. But by and large, the success that we saw in our report were funded by the country themselves. There were a couple of projects that received some outside voluntary funding, but Mexico, Vietnam were basically self-funded. El Salvador did have kind of, in a way, self-funding from Salvadoran citizens. So that was kind of maybe not a surprising result, but one that just kind of shows that maybe some of the credit really goes to these countries themselves for having the political will to put up the money to do that. So, it's unclear whether that could happen in other cases as well. So that's why we concluded that it would probably be best to kind of increase and continue funding for these efforts from the outside so that it can reach other countries that might not be able to do some of that self-funding that we saw in a lot of these cases.
Thank you. And the next question is, how do these examples relate to the UNFCCC REDD Plus negotiations?
I think in that case, it's the kind of political momentum element that we saw be really important in a lot of countries, that, kind of years worth of REDD negotiations has helped influence. So I think it's just been important that having an international level, kind of high level conversation about REDD at the UN, I think has really brought this issue to a higher place within a lot of these countries. What we've seen more recently in the REDD negotiations is a lot more decisions on technical details, and I think a lot of the kind of independent verification that was important for us for this report will also be important for kind of making the REDD, kind of international REDD mechanism work. So that's kind of another piece that relate the two.
Thank you. So our next question asks about some reviews and thoughts and feedback on the report. And I know it's been widely publicized, and this person asks, there have been some comments that the report claims that REDD is successful without looking at some of the important aspects of REDD, such as leakage, additionality, and socioeconomic spread of benefits, and data sources.
Okay. I guess I don't understand the data sources.
Well, maybe
could you do? Yeah, I can just talk kind of generally about the kind of scope of our report.
Yeah.
And
great.
We we're basing our analysis on the information that we could find from independent sources. So we didn't do kind of any of use any of our own kind of analysis of, let's say, mapping to identify leakage, but instead we tried to find that as much as possible in the data sources that we used. So that was kind of our scope, was to use the information that was already out there. Some of the data has kind of better information on leakage and additionality than others. Brazil, for example, has a very clear baseline and have been very transparent about that. So additionality is a little easier to assess there. Leakage, there's been some really interesting analysis done by a couple of researchers on Vietnam, showing that they're clearly still using wood products, even though they're not really making them within the country anymore because they're trying to use most of their plantations for reforestation. But analysis of leakage there has shown that it has not been as high as maybe some people would expect. So if you kind of take a look at the original data sources that are in the report, you can find a lot of that, and we do have kind of go into more explanation of kind of the scope of our report towards the introduction. So that will have even more details.
Perfect. So the next question is a nice one, and this is from Lena, and Lena says, "It's good to hear positive stories for once," with a smiley face. And Lena says, "I'm just wondering, relatively speaking, do you know if how much of a difference these success stories have made to the global deforestation rates? Is that something, Pipa, you have seen or have thoughts on?"
Sure. So this is, I would suggest that you read a recent blog post by the director of our Tropical Forest and Climate Initiative on kind of how all this information changes over time. But when REDD kind of started on the international climate agenda, a lot of people use the term, that deforestation was responsible for 20% of global emissions. And our recent analysis is that it's now about 10% of global emissions. And there are three kind of main reasons for that. The first being that if it's a percentage, you have both a numerator, which is the emissions from deforestation, and a denominator, which is global emissions. And global emissions from mostly the fossil fuel sector have gone up, so that's one reason why relatively it's smaller. There have also been some changes in the data and kind of analysis that's used to estimate that number. But we've also seen that these successes are one of the major reasons why the relative amount of global climate change emissions from deforestation have gone down. And I think that's a really great story, and it's really important to keep that in mind, that there are ways that we can address climate change from the land sector. And what we have seen over the years of really keeping track of this is that it can actually make a dent. So yeah, we have seen that it has made an impact in terms of global emissions.
Great. So moving from that one in terms of making an impact, the next question comes from William, and William asks essentially about how we could replicate these successes. And the question is, have you got any analysis or opinions on how many other countries or locations these success stories could be applied to? So for example, are there other regions with similar economic or political situations to Guyana or Vietnam where certain types of programs could be applied?
That's a really great question, and we didn't kind of follow through in our analysis all the way to that, to kind of looking at similar cases. I think kind of as I summarize at the end, we have essentially like 11 or 12 stories in here, and each of them were extremely different. So I think what's really important is to understand those elements that we saw as most common, including the combination of the kind of policies to get environmental outcomes being coupled with kind of social and economic outcomes, and identifying, within each case, what are the drivers of deforestation and what are the kind of social and economic outcomes that are needed to also get the environmental outcome. So rather than I think trying to just take kind of what we found and apply it directly to another situation, I think maybe the way of looking at it is looking at the situation in the place where you're trying to kind of make an intervention and identify what the opportunities really are there. Obviously there's a lot of parts of the world that weren't covered by this report, and so it would be really important to try to replicate success there. And I think Central Africa was really to me one of the most important stories in the report, because it has such an enormous block of forest and it has the potential for deforestation in the future. And so avoiding that and putting into place the policies and seeing kind of the development happen there without deforestation, if we can kind of continue that success down the road, it would just be so important.
So the next question also touches on Central Africa, and this question says, first of all, congratulations on this work. So the question is, can low deforestation rates in Central Africa be called a success, as they are often and mostly driven by temporary funds in competing sectors, such as mining?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see kind of that relationship. I think certainly the numbers show that it is a success, and the efforts by the government to address logging, which is right now one of the major drivers of deforestation in the region, have been really important. So the Congo Basin Forest Partnership has been really important to some of the success that has been seen there. But yeah, I do think that the fact that this has meant maybe an increase in especially oil, that obviously also has some climate impacts, and that the region has been increasing their food imports, can mean that this result might not either be permanent or might not have kind of all of the same positive impacts outside of the region. So that's why I kind of highlighted it as one of the places where some specific policies and specific interventions are probably needed to solidify that success, make it as positive as possible. Certainly it can be seen as positive that there's increasing wealth in the region, but it needs to be done, in a sustainable way and in a way that continues to protect the forest into the future.
So moving on to the next question, this person asks, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that these approaches did not violate social or environmental safeguards. Can you speak a bit more to that point and to the approach that you used? Because there is the point that some may argue that Brazil's command and control measures do impact small farmers in the Amazon. So if you could speak a bit to that point, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, again, just in terms of the scope of the report, we did use data that were provided to us. So I think there probably could always be some stories that and anecdotes that would lead people to maybe have different opinions. But we used all the information that we could find. Certainly looking at some of the environmental and social safeguards were easier for actually more of the project level work, because of the reporting that they have had to do, mostly for the verified carbon standard. So the work in say Kenya and the work in Madagascar have a lot more reporting on safeguards than some of the broader level work, or kind of more government and regional level work. So I think it'll be really important to see under the UN system, Brazil is going to have to do more transparent, share more transparent information about the safeguards. So I think it'll be really important to see that when it comes out.
Great. So the next question takes it out to a much bigger scope of 2015 climate change agreement. So the question is, if you can share your thoughts on if you think the next climate change agreement of 2015 should encompass some guidelines regarding deforestation, and if so, what kind? So again, obviously much larger scope than this report here, but perhaps you can share some thoughts.
Sure, yeah, and just to kind of give a little bit of background of why my opinion on this might be interesting to some of you. A lot of the work I do for the Union of Concerned Scientists outside of doing this kind of analysis is at the UN climate negotiations, so it's a venue that I know very intimately. So, you know, we definitely think that forests and land use in general, because obviously there are a lot of emissions from agriculture as well, is a really important part of having an ambitious goal to addressing climate change. When you add kind of deforestation and agriculture together, it's about a quarter of global emissions, so it doesn't seem like something that can be ignored. And I think what could be really beneficial about the agreement that hopefully we'll get in 2015 and implement a few years later is that it could address forest and agriculture in all countries and really provide a lot of support for those countries that have a lot of potential for emissions reductions that maybe don't have the funding right now. And then it could also hold developed countries to a high standard of reducing their own emissions from both forestry and agriculture. You know, all these successes clearly were only in developing countries, and there's a lot of potential globally still in developed countries and in other countries. So, so in terms of how that might happen and what it might look like and what kind of guidance we might get, you know, personally, I'm trying to go in, you know, what we kind of learned from this report was the need for flexibility. So trying to go in such a way that we get an agreement that, you know, has really high ambition in the land sector and uses a lot of the tools that we've seen can work and leverages those to create greater ambition rather than maybe doing something that is extremely prescriptive. When you compare kind of what we've had just on forests for developing countries, which is essentially REDD, and developed countries, in a way the approach, although it provides very specific guidelines for REDD countries, the idea behind it is a little more flexible than what we've seen from developed countries, and we've actually then seen that you know, developed countries have taken I would say kind of a more defensive approach rather than a proactive approach, which what we've seen in REDD countries. So I think it's really important that the policy design at the UN kind of promote that more proactive approach that generates opportunities rather than create kind of a very heavy system that just makes countries shy away from even providing information on their forests and agriculture. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to people who are a little less involved in the UN, but I think, you know, the main point is something that's ambitious and something that's flexible.
Thank you. And as we go on to the next question, I'm just going to put up this next slide so people can see this as we're covering questions. Some more resources here. As a reminder, the learning sessions, you can find the archive of this and other learning sessions, and then the UCS Forest Solutions to Global Warming site is up there, and the UCS Expert Network is up there. So as you...
And if I can just make a quick comment on our expert network, you know, that's really open to all kinds of experts. So scientists, economists, you know, definitely check it out. We are extremely inclusive of what an expert is, so don't shy away just because it includes that name.
Great, thanks. It's a good clarification to make. So the next question, and we're getting here to the end of our time, so this we'll probably just do a handful of questions here and then we'll wrap up. But the next question says, this report shows that the rate of deforestation is falling. For example, clearing trees is still going on, but less than in the past. Other studies have shown that the rate has been rising. Can you explain, or do you think these are looking at different time frames, or do you have any thoughts on how those discrepancies may have come about in different reports?
Yeah, so I think probably the most common literature that is used to show that deforestation is going up is something that just came out recently from Matt Hansen. And I think, you know, the person asking this question definitely has a very clear understanding of all of the different kind of factors and elements that go into to creating a number for deforestation. Timeframes is certainly part of it. So Matt Hansen's data, because it was based solely on satellite monitoring, essentially captured any kind of, we can kind of use a single tree as a metaphor, but any single tree that was being cut down, even if that tree was then being replaced by another tree. So he captured a lot more of than what we would consider deforestation. What we were looking at is the replacement of forests with other land uses. So to us, deforestation is when you you know, clear an area of trees and then no trees are going to come back in kind of the next reasonable time period, couple decades. So as I said, you know, that's largely for a large-scale commodity production, like you know, clearing a forest and replacing it with soybean farms, or replacing it with a pasture for beef, or replacing it with a palm oil plantation, which we wouldn't really consider as a forest. So that's kind of the time frame issue. The other issue is, you know, kind of whether it's at a global scale or at a national scale. And I think, you know, when we say that deforestation is, you know, we have examples from national scales, but, you know, the kind of change from 20% of emissions from deforestation to 10% is on a global scale.
Thank you. And our last question here, we will wrap up with this question from Natasha. And Natasha asks, based on your research, how does the role of, or what role does measuring additionality play in the success of these countries? Is that something you can touch on here for our final comment from you?
Sure. You know, I think the reason that we kind of put this in the context of the forest transition curve was to show that, to us, success was moving to a better part of the curve. So either for, you know, low deforestation rate countries staying low, or for other countries kind of shifting the shape of that curve, or maybe getting to the reforestation efforts more quickly and having deforestation happen less steeply. So that was kind of our context. I think for the political context and relating any successes to emissions reductions that are ultimately going to be funded, it's really important to show additionality. And what has happened at the UN level is a very specific technical approach to setting a country's baseline, and that'll be the way that additionality is shown within the policy context.
Perfect. Thank you. So with that, we have come to the end of our time here, and I just want to flip through to this second slide of additional resources from WWF and UCS. So these are all online, and you can run through those quickly. And a few other ways here that you can stay connected, both with UCS and with the WWF Forest and Climate Program. And I want to thank Pipa again for the presentation today. I want to thank everyone who attended for the great questions and for joining us at this learning session. We hope it was useful. And with that, I will bring us to a close. And thank you again. As a reminder, a PDF copy of this presentation as well as a video recording will be available within the next business day or two on reddcommunity.org, and you will receive a link to that place in your follow-up email. So thanks again. Thanks, Pipa, and we'll talk to you
Thank you so much.
soon, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye.